Alrighty. So today we're finishing off Acts chapter 16, verses 25 to verse 40 there at the end. So I'll read the passage, and then we'll commence from there. Alrighty. So Acts chapter 16, verse 25 to 40. But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there came a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the jailhouse were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were unfastened. And when the jailer awoke and saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." He called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. And after he brought them out, he said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And they said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your house." And they spoke the word of the Lord to him together with all who were in his household. And he took them that very hour of the night and washed their wounds, and immediately he was baptized, he and all his household. And he brought them into his house and set food before them, and rejoiced greatly with his household, so with his whole household, because he had believed in God. Now when day came, the chief magistrates sent their policemen, saying, "Release those men." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The chief magistrates have sent to release you. Therefore come out now and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "Having beaten us in public without trial, men who are Romans, they have thrown us into prison, and now they're sending us away secretly? Absolutely not. But let them come themselves and bring us out." And the policemen reported these words to the chief magistrates. They were afraid when they heard that they were Romans, and they came and appealed to them, and when they had brought them out, they kept requesting them to leave the city. And they went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia. And when they saw the brothers, they encouraged them and left. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So this passage here, finishing off Acts chapter 16, is obviously continuing what we've been seeing throughout the majority of this chapter. Paul and Co.'s time in Philippi. We saw last week one of the most fascinating passages in all of Acts, one of my favourites at least, and with the little corrupt syndicate / enterprise that was going on there in Philippi of a consortium of wealthy and powerful individuals using a priestess of Apollo associated with the temple at Delphi. One referred to as possessing the spirit of Python, the chaos monster that Apollo slays in ancient Greek mythology. And she was telling fortunes. She was engaging in clairvoyance, functionally. She follows them around, follows the group around as they're evangelizing and as they're preaching and teaching in Philippi. Before then, eventually, after a few days, Paul drives the spirit or the demonic spirit from the woman. She's then unable to tell fortunes anymore. She is functionally, at least we can infer from the text, converted as a result. It's not explicitly spelt out, but the implications of the text is that there's a distinct change in the woman. But more importantly, the powerful consortium are wrathful in their anger. They complain to the chief magistrates of the city of Philippi. They whip the crowd into a a democratic frenzy and the mob takeover, as it were, wherein they, including the authorities as well, the chief magistrates, attack them. They beat them mercilessly. They tear garments off and then they throw them in prison. And then this is where the story then picks up. We explained a number of points last week that come to fruition by the time you get to the second half of this morning's passage. So we'll recover that when we get there. But nonetheless, so let's begin in verse 25. But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. We've seen this before with Peter's imprisonment in past chapters. Here now Paul is being imprisoned and is carrying the same motif of not despair and discouragement, but rather contentment and joy. Ultimately, this comes not from the fact that his false imprisonment is a good or a righteous thing. That's obviously not true. But rather it is a rejoicing and a comfortability in the sovereignty of God, in knowing that God's will is sovereign in the world, that Christ is victorious over his enemies, and that nothing that is thrown his way, as it were, can ultimately separate him from the love and the grace. The love and the grace of Christ. This is the context in which passages like what Paul does go on to say when he describes, by the time he gets towards the latter years of his life, the various times he's been jailed multiple times, or that he's been shipwrecked before, he's been beaten mercilessly, he was stoned. We've already seen him being stoned nearly to the point of death within an inch of his life in I think Derbe or Lystra, Derbe I think, the previous journey, all these various things, but that none of the evil that is perpetrated against him can separate him from the forgiveness of Christ, from his being sanctified in Christ, and him being held within Christ's grasp, as it were. This is ultimately a display of his strength of faith, strength of belief, trust, confidence in the sovereignty of God. Okay, that God is sovereign, God is in charge, God has things under control, and he works all things together for good for those who love him. Again, that's the context. It doesn't mean that you constantly never have anything go wrong in your life. It doesn't mean, in fact, it means the opposite. The whole context of when Paul says this to the Romans, in Romans chapter 8, is that in the face of all that, God ultimately works all things together for the ultimate good, as opposed to the ultimate evil, for those who love him, right? For those who are called according to his grace and to his will. This is the context in which these verses are understood. This is why, just as a brief side point, it's why it's so unhelpful is a diplomatic way of putting it. Really, you could use stronger words, I suppose. When people in the modern day just simply take a given verse or a given sentence in isolation and then try and apply it to just some generic, as basically like a wallpaper to put on, your wall. The kind of the common victim of this is Jeremiah chapter 29, I believe it is. Yes. The verse, yeah. And yeah, I know the plans I have for you to prosper you, not to harm you. Like, yeah. Whilst failing to understand that this is God speaking in the context of the Judeans about to be wiped off the face of the earth by Babylon, undergoing one of the most comprehensive destructions and conquests in all of the ancient world, the Babylonian conquest of the kingdom of Judea, successively beginning in 609 BC and then kind of being finalised in 586 BC.
Paul's example here,
yep,
I may say, is very instructive to new Christians.
100%. Yep.
And even to
Christians long in the tooth who may have been living comfortably.
Christians.
Yeah, a lot who have been comfortable.
He had unswerving faith that despite the floggings, the imprisonments, the starvations, and so on and so forth, the list is long, that the Lord Jesus Christ had him always in the palm of his hand.
Correct.
Personally, I have prayed for things in the past, and my prayers were ostensibly answered, but they were answered in a very unexpected way, and I thought curse had come upon me. But thank you, Lord, I in along these lines held fast, and then it was only in time that I saw the blessing. What was evil, the Lord used for good. And he does it, of course, for our benefit, not for his benefit, because he knows all things.
Correct. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It's not. It's exactly.
But it's tough.
Yes.
Isn't it, for a Christian to persevere when the going is tough? It's very tough sometimes, because you pray earnestly to the Lord. He ostensibly answers the prayer, so he provides something that's physical. You might have prayed for a new home, a new car, a new preacher, and you're given this. You're given
this is the earthquake that we're about to read about.
You're given this. You think it's the Lord answering your prayer, which it is. But he's not answering it in the way that you expect.
That you expect, or that you want being the opposite. Want being the opposite word. He's answering the way that you need, but not in the way you want. Yeah, correct. And so see, it's those instances of difficulties of various kinds. Be they, again, they're often relative, because what someone goes through might be really difficult for them compared to what they've been through. It might be easier for someone who's had a life of difficulty, right? So it's always relative in that particular sense. But no matter what level of difficulty, of trial, of tribulation that one goes through in various different kinds, including being falsely imprisoned and beaten to a pulp, it really, what it does is it exposes you, at least on the individual level, before you even talk about kind of the corporate setting, but at least on an individual level, it exposes you to the things that really matter. At a fundamental level, when undergoing something like this, right, and I'll use Paul as the example here. I know Silas is also in prison, but the thing that Paul and Silas are facing here is a really ultimately on the kind of theological and metaphysical level is a genuine test of belief, of how much confidence they actually have in what it is that they're actually telling people. Okay, they're proclaiming to people that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah. He's the Savior. He is the King of Kings. He really did die and really was raised from the dead. He really did ascend and is now ruling and reigning. He really is actually all of these things. He really is God in the flesh. He really is the Logos. Okay, all these various things. And here, though, this is the personal, I suppose, pragmatic or functional testing of whether they actually believe that. Okay, because on a basic level, when undergoing something really brutal, especially what Christians have suffered for thousands of years, which is horrific levels of torture. We've just finished in church history covering the Apostolic Fathers, right? So Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and Polycarp of Smyrna, all three of whom were martyred. Clement is drowned to death up in the Black Sea, up in Crimea, what today would be Crimea. Polycarp is attempted. They try to burn him, but God miraculously spares him, so that they then eventually spear him to death in Rome. And then also Ignatius is taken from Antioch to Rome, where he's then condemned to damnatio bestia, which is the death by beast or damnation by beast. So he's fed the lions. Now, when lions are ripping you apart, that'll really test you. That when you know that that's coming, do you understand? And he knows that's coming because he's had an armed guard of 10 guards who transported him from Antioch all the way to Rome, right? Thousands of a significant journey that would have taken that took months. You have a long time to be thinking about the fate that waits you, which is getting ripped apart by some of the most terrifying creatures on earth. that will test whether or not you actually do genuinely believe that this God is omnipotent, that this God is omniscient, that this God actually does know all things, that this Jesus is actually God incarnate, and that he either is that or any other option other than that is different. So he either is this or he's not this. Even if you say he's something else, that's something that's not that. Do you understand? So he either is God or he's not.
It's remarkable the trials and tribulations that Christians, including we, have gone through.
Yep.
But compare the falling away of many souls after,
sadly,
during and after lockdown, 2.5, 3 years ago,
Yep.
to facing lions in the arena.
Yeah, correct, and that's the point. Yeah, I've said that before. Unfortunately, is that see, I look back on those who did apostatize in the early church and other times as well, but we're talking about the early church in the case of like Ignatius and stuff, where they renounced their allegiance to Jesus by offering a sacrifice to Caesar. Oh, well, okay, really? What happened to them? Oh, well, they were tortured for 3 months in a dungy Roman prison. Oh, is that all? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, the conditions under which they broke their oaths and abandoned their loyalties was they were tortured brutally. Do you understand? So that doesn't make it acceptable. What it does is it puts it in context, though. In the last couple of years, when Christians betrayed their allegiance to God as actually sovereign, God as being in charge, God as being the one who's meant to be obeyed other than men, or rather than men. What was it that you were under? Oh, well, I couldn't go to the cinema. Do you understand the level? What can you do? I wasn't able to. Or they said that if I didn't do it, they said then I wouldn't be able to go out to a restaurant and hang out with my friends.
You're describing the church that is eagerly awaiting rapture.
Well, that's not true.
No, well, he is. Well, but on a broad level, there is that element where it can draw a level of. It doesn't automatically, but it can for some, and I've met plenty of people who it has. It can draw a level of complacency. Shouldn't, but it can, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't think such a church should be eagerly expecting that. I think it should be expecting to be looking itself in the looking glass.
And realising that, the difficulties and trials are easily able to be beset upon a given generation. Yeah, 100%. And that's been the common thread all throughout. It's still the common thread. Again, we've explained before, but over in excess of 80% of all people on earth who are persecuted for religious reasons are Christians. So if you took 100 people who are persecuted for the explicit reason of religion, 80 of them are going to be Christians. And that number is pretty much commensurate with those who are murdered for the same reasons, right? It's not even that. Oh, historically Christianity has been the most persecuted religion. That's a true statement. No, today it is. It still is. That's not different. Today that's still the case. That's no different. That's no different at all.
It's interesting that the persecution has re-crept into the Western Hemisphere.
Correct. Yeah.
Such as Ukraine, such as Canada.
Yep. Yeah. In Western civilization generally, yeah. And it's not even persecution is not a comparative thing. That's what I said to you. It's not a question of relative. It's not a question of until you reach a certain point, then that doesn't really. Unless people are being massacred, that's now persecution. No one's been killed here yet in terms of like the apostles, right? All the apostles are still alive, right? Peter's still alive, Paul's still alive. At this point here, are they being persecuted? Yes. Right, so none of them are being killed. So people being killed clearly is not the defining metric of what constitutes the starting point of persecution, right? Persecution is not even first and foremost about the actual pragmatism. It's not about the functional actions. It's actually the ideology and the ethos behind it. That's what constitutes persecution. Do you understand? This is not just being done for the sake in and of itself. It's being done for a purpose. And as soon as something's done for a purpose, that's now the realm of ideas, right? It's people's ideology that drives action, not the other way around.
The comfortable Western church forgets that persecution is spiritual persecution.
Correct. Yeah, that's its origin. Yeah, that's the point I'm making about as soon as something is done for a reason, for a purpose, you're now crossed over from just pure pragmatism into ideas, ideology, right? That's what it is. Spiritual reasons. Yeah.
Look at the number of comfortable Western Christians who essentially don't even know they're under significant spiritual persecution.
That's the issue. Well, that's what we talked about before we started the study. Yeah, and exactly right. Completely unawares. And see you mentioned Ukraine, so it might be worthwhile mentioning it there as well. So the pragmatic like the actual outworking of persecution that Ukrainian Christians are currently facing isn't just for purely pragmatic. It's for deeply ideological reasons. Okay, the Zelensky government has deemed that anyone associated with the UOC, the Ukrainian Orthodox, so the original actual, been around for 1,000 years, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, anyone associated with that are too friendly with Russia.
They're Russian puppets.
They're Russian puppets. That's the distinct...
Or worse, spies.
Or spies, yeah, or spies. And that's the real impetus. That's the legal justification for it. And so the universal declaration that anyone associated with the UOC has ties to Russia and or is actually an asset of the Russian SVR or FSB gives carte blanche to do what they've, in their mind, do what we now see, right? Stealing, literally seizing church properties and buildings and houses and etc. Burning churches to the ground, falsely imprisoning priests, torturing priests. There are priests, to my knowledge, that have been killed. All these these various kinds of things, because it's all driven off of what ideology?
Fully sanctioned, by the way, by the US administration, the Australian government.
Completely sanctioned, completely funded,
Union.
Completely approved, even implicitly approved. You don't even need express approval. Tacit, implicit approval by the fact that you continue to support them, continue to fund them, continue to arm them, continue to train them. Okay, all these various things. Because the West is now incapable of thinking outside of what I like to call the Disney view of the world. Good, these guys bad. Incapable of thinking that life is a Hollywood movie where there's a hero and a villain, as opposed to a bunch of villains fighting each other.
You mentioned that rather ironically, I'd say, because the leader of the Ukrainian government, the executive, is an actor.
Literally. Yeah, that's what's a bit spooky about it, because he actually...
Who speaks scripted words.
Yeah, he actually featured in a movie because he was a comedian before he became president, and an actor. He actually featured in a movie where he, playing a comedian, even though he wasn't a reality comedian, actually accidentally wins an election and becomes president of Ukraine. He featured in a movie like that, and then that actually happened in real life. It's hilarious. But that part aside, yeah. And so that's what's led to all the various things about this supposed flourishing democracy in Ukraine, where other political parties have been banned, political opponents have been imprisoned, all these kinds of mass amounts of things that are...
Journalists disappearing, being murdered.
Journalists just vanishing off the face of the earth. All these kinds of things in this great flourishing democracy that is Ukraine.
We had all these Australians 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, we had all these Australians and all these Americans and all these Germans flying Ukrainian flags in their front garden or putting the Ukrainian flag up on their Facebook profile.
Correct, yeah.
What a joke.
And half time can't even point Ukraine on the map, yeah.
And some of them call themselves Christians. Ignorant Christians.
Ignorance, yeah.
Mind you, I'm ignorant myself. So.
Yeah, look, yeah, exactly. They're by the grace of God go I as well. But the difference is, though, is that we're called to a higher standard. We're called to a higher standard. Correct, yeah. We're called... The truth is a very serious issue. And I mean, how much... Proportionally speaking, I think it should be fairly obvious. But like, proportionally speaking, Christ spends a lot of time talking about truth and about what comes out of your mouth versus what goes in, right? He, especially in his context where he's talking to Pharisees who were far more concerned with the cleanliness of food and with all the minutiae of the Mosaic code. Beyond that as well, even going well past that into just simple, basically rabbinic traditions, which they claimed went back to Moses but did not in reality. And being so more focused on things like the Korban rule, divvying up how much to the grain, how much of their cumin in their kitchen was being donated to the devil. Meanwhile, torrents of serpentine lies, as it were, flow forth from your mouth. Be more concerned with what comes out. That's why Christ said the power of life and death is in the tongue, right? And a well-known figure of speech in his day, but the actual moral, ethical, and philosophical point of that is really, really powerful. It's not just about saying mean words either. It's about the fact that truth versus lies is the distinction between good and evil. And good produces life, evil produces death. Truth produces order, lies produce chaos. Right? The power of life and death is in the tongue. That's the whole point of that statement, being more concerned with what comes out of the mouth, because it reveals what's within. Do you understand? And so the importance of speaking the truth at all costs, when the costs are actually personal costs, that's where the rubber hits the road, so it were. Do you know what I mean? And that's what this kind of scenario is entailing. See, they're not, just like we've encountered plenty of times before, like the very first time that back in Acts chapter 5, that Peter and John are hauled before the Jewish authorities. Again, same issues. Saying that Jesus was the King of the Jews, Jesus is the King of the world. Yeah, exactly. They're told to shut your mouth and stop saying this stuff.
And they disobey?
And they disobey.
But they're Christians.
Yeah, hold on.
You can't disobey.
That's exactly, you can't do that. We're meant to lick the boots of those in power. He says sarcastically. Their point blank response is, we are to obey God rather than men. Right? As John Knox once said, the great Scottish reformer, a couple hundred years ago, said when tyranny becomes law, obedience becomes duty. Right? We actually have a moral and ethical duty to resist tyranny. To not resist tyranny is to inherently affirm it, by definition. This is why Christ uses such explicit rhetoric, really black and white on these kinds of issues. You are with me or you are against me. Do you understand? There's no magic middle ground. In other words, right? And that same concept can be applied, that kind of binary concept can be applied to anything else. You either speak the truth or you're speaking lies. Even something that's mostly true is still actually false. Do you understand? All these kinds of things. Because ultimately something is either true or anything other than 100% truth is a lie, by definition. And this concept is not terribly difficult to understand. You can hand someone a glass of water with just one tiny droplet of rat poison, and they will not drink it. But it's 99-point-something% clear, guys. It's 99-point-something% pure. You don't want to drink it? No. Because the littlest thing, the littlest bit of poison, corrupts the whole. And such is the case here. So, continuing on, in verse 26, and suddenly there came a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the jailhouse were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were unfastened. Now, we could spend quite a while talking about the what's called the typology of earthquakes, the typological meaning of earthquakes. Quite often in used in the Old Testament, it's used it's used almost ubiquity as a sign of judgment. You see this particularly in the prophets. And here this is both typological, right? So symbolic and functional. So there's obviously the functional reality of having the jail shake, the doors fling open, or their chains break off, because keep in mind they're in chains, right? Their chains break off the walls, whatever happens, etc., etc. But the symbolic element of that as well is really important in terms of the meaning. It's not judgment obviously on Paul and Silas, it's judgment on those who have imprisoned them. Yet what we're going to see is something that actually is different from when in previous times Peter was imprisoned. Okay, and I'll harken back to that as we work our way through. So in verse 27, when the jailer awoke and saw, so in other words the guard, when the jailer awoke and saw the prison doors opened, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. We explained this in previous chapters, going back a number of chapters to when Peter himself was imprisoned, where similar thing occurs. There's no earthquake, but Peter's angel frees him, and he escapes the prison. And those prisoners, those jailers, those prison guards are then brought before Herod and are then executed. The punishment for allowing this was death, and they knew that, and he knows that. So he's going to commit suicide because that's what's coming for him anyway, death. The difference here is that God through Paul stops that. Okay. And so in verse 28, and Paul cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." Okay. So they haven't escaped. So the purpose here was not actually to escape. Now, by the time you get to the end of the chapter, you see that they're released anyway. So that's part of the bigger story. But the point here is that this is not actually about a jailbreak. So what was the actual purpose then? The conversion of this jailer.
The jailer and his family.
Correct. And so...
Can we just pause there for a moment?
Go for it.
Is this part of Scripture really suggesting that all this lead up was for the purpose of one jailer and his household? Really?
There was multitudes of things going on here, but that's one of the central things, yeah.
I'm saying yes.
That's my point.
That's how God operates.
Yeah.
God operates in his own operational...
Yeah, correct. Because this is...
dimension, not in ours.
Correct, yeah. And we get, by the time we get, and that's one of the points that I'll draw by the time we get to verse 40, because this gets spelled out in verse 40. But yes, this confluence of events is actually with the one who we don't know his name, but we call him the Philippian jailer, for obvious reasons, with the Philippian jailer, and then by extension his household, his family.
He's a Gentile too then, was he?
Yeah, he's a Gentile, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, he's a Gentile.
He's a Gentile.
Yeah.
Which is different.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Yeah, no, he's Gentile. The whole big one of the big meta-narrative points of this second missionary journey here beginning in Acts 16 is about we're entirely in the Gentile realm, as it were. They cross over into Europe for the first time.
What did the Lord himself say to Ananias in the dream vision? He said, "This Paul I will use."
Yeah, correct, yeah.
And he will suffer
greatly for my name. Yeah.
There you go, Paul.
Yeah, correct.
And Paul would have realised, Paul had no idea this was going to happen.
No.
But shortly after it happened, he realised.
Yeah, and by the time he gets to the end of his life, when he's eventually executed in Rome in and around AD 60, 67, 68, the kind of tail end of the Neronic persecution under Nero, he's writing a number of these letters in the early to mid 60s, when now he's got kind of this hindsight, he sees the bigger picture of these things. Paul's suffering was unique among the apostles, not in terms of death. They all died with the exception, they were all martyred, they were all murdered except with the exception of the Apostle John. Not for want of trying, of course, but they tried to, but failed. But nonetheless, all of them died. And in all the various ways, I mean, Peter is crucified upside down as kind of a mockery. A number of them are crucified. There's beheadings. Thomas is speared to death over in India. Matthew is, I believe, beheaded. Bartholomew is filleted, in other words, skinned to death. Various other horrors. But his sufferings throughout his life were unique among the apostles. And part of that, it's always been an interesting point. It's not so much one we can go into here for time's sake, but part of that really does tie back to Christ's words that he must suffer greatly for my name. I think part of that is It's not so much in the concept of like penance or like temporal justice per se. This is the one who was leading the charge in the murder of Christians. And it's not like a get square. It's simply that great suffering you have caused, great suffering you shall endure, but through that you will triumph in Christ.
It's a
Do you understand?
one. It's a difficult one for
Yeah.
regarding Paul. I mean, you've said before, it's clear throughout the eons that Paul is unique.
Yes, in this context.
He's
yes.
unique. The Lord used his uniqueness. I mean, he set the uniqueness up and then used it.
Yep, and from birth. even going back to who he was as a person, ethnic Jew, born and raised as a Greek, or at least culturally Hellenic, educated in Greek education systems, as well as
gifted Pharisee.
A highly gifted Pharisee, one of the most prominent Pharisees of his generation, and is also a Roman citizen. Right, so it's the perfect amalgamation of the Hebrew context, the Greek context, the Roman context, all in one person. It's a similar functionary reality as that of Christ, fully God, fully man. So the incarnation is the most vital component of Jesus. Everything else that Jesus did would have been not just irrelevant, but would have, by definition, been ineffectual if it weren't for the incarnation, right? It's by Christ uniting the divine and the human in one person, himself, that actually then reconciles those two, right? It's by God taking on humanity, right, that he's then able to reconcile humanity to the divine, because he's reconciled the human and the divine in himself. Yes. Do you understand? So the representative element, when we talk about Jesus being our federal head or our representative as our high priest, that's not just in a purely symbolic sense, although it's laden with symbology. It's actually in a ontological sense, okay? Because Christ, the man, is hanging on the cross. That is, Christ, the God-man, is hanging on the cross. So all of that's extremely, extremely important. The incarnation changed everything. As the world, as matter had been regressing from its connection with God, that then begins reversing in the incarnation, right? Think not that I've come to condemn the world, but rather to redeem it is the literal word, but come to save it, in other words. All these various things. And so that gets played out there. The point about the Philippian jailer and his centrality we get to, especially by the time we get to the end. So let's continue working through. Verse 29. And he, in the Philippian jailer, called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. Trembling with fear because he had just figured that his life was about to end imminently, and he now realizes that his existence will actually continue beyond that night. Verse 30, and after he brought them out, he said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" So again, the obvious, you have to think about why this is, you have to, not fill in the blanks, you have to read the passage and follow the story, right? It's like reading any good novel or watching any good movie. You have to follow the narrative arc in the story, right? His response here, if you just take it in isolation, seems like an odd one. Sirs, what must I do to be saved? There's been from the passage we're talking about here, verse 25, and following through to verse, there's been Paul hasn't uttered a single word other than what we had in verse 28. But, hold on. No, let me finish the point. I know where you're going to go, but I'm actually going to the same spot, okay? In terms of the text of what we're reading, it's not like we're coming off the tail end of a great sermon.
No, true.
We're getting to the same point. You're about to jump in with what I'm about to say. What he's been hearing all night, though, is hymns and prayers and the gospel and the biblical text all throughout the prayers, right? Do you know what I'm saying? He'd be reciting scripture over and over, all these various things. That's where you're going?
Absolutely.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. That's what I'm going to.
And look at the beautiful parallelism between this event, the jailer hearing essentially the gospel preached, and Paul himself having heard the gospel preached when Stephen was preaching.
That's the connection I was going to make.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah, exactly. So when you go all the way back to Acts chapter 8, where the first martyr of the church, Stephanos, victor, the victor, the one who triumphs, the one whose name literally means crown, for receiving the crown of life. The fact that he was indeed the one who was the first. We call him the proto-martyr, which means the first martyr of the church, the one who was first executed for his faith, in a very, very public way, dragged out of the temple, mauled, beaten mercilessly as he's dragged out of the city. Very important again. That obviously that really happened, but the symbology there is also really important as well, in that he was beaten and dragged and mauled and dragged out of the temple and out of the city, just like Christ was dragged out, out of the temple complex and then out of the city, and put outside the city. The Jewish authorities casting him out into the wilderness like they would cast out the goat on whom the sins of the people were put during the ritual sacrifice. All of that's there, right? Except it's through that he actually triumphs. He has an incredible theophany, right? He sees the heavens open up and he sees Christ enthroned in the heavens, and all these various things. And Paul's there orchestrating it all, right, as they stone him to death. Similar thing going on here. That's the parallels that are being drawn, is that he is seeing, he is witnessing, and this is the whole concept of like to witness. Well, this is really witnessing. The Philippian jailer has been listening to this all night. He's been hearing scripture being recited and chanted and prayed and etc. etc.
By the way, they're both jailers.
Yeah.
The Philippian jailer is a jailer.
And Paul
is an ex-jailer.
Paul was a jailer / executioner. Yeah, correct.
And they both got evangelized through listening.
Through hearing, yeah, exactly. They hear. Yeah, correct. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Plenty of people hear, but they don't often listen. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, and that we often forget that. But nonetheless, but point being here, yeah, exactly. He's been. So that's the point I'm trying to draw. In terms of the way that Luke's recounting this, we haven't been given some grand exposition. We just got one sentence, right? Throughout the night, right, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise, right? So he's been hearing, again, the presumption there, this has been going on throughout the night, right? He's been hearing scripture recited, he's been hearing, hymns sung, he's been hearing chanting, all these kinds of things. And
by the way, my version says hymns, but then italicizes the word psalms. So in the Greek, I think it's psalmodia.
I'm going to have a look in verse 25.
So it's the psalms that the jailer was listening to.
Hymnon to Theon, Ebekroy, and listening. We're back up. Yeah. So we have. I'm just finding wrong verse. Back up a bit. Yeah, hymnon. So you have the singing of praises to Theon, to God. You have prosuchomenoi, so the praying, plural. All of that's kind of encapsulated in that thought. Yeah, exactly. Keeping in mind that the hymn book of the Old Testament is the book of Psalms. And so they're praying. They're when we think of singing. Again, the way that the Psalms were sung was actually what we probably today call chanting. That's why the church has a very rich history of what's called plain song or plain chant, which is a cappella. The word a cappella, Italian for in the style of the chapel, cappella, chapel, so the church. And so that tradition is still quite rich, obviously in Anglicanism, it's quite rich in Lutheranism, even obviously in the Eastern churches and in Rome as well. And so that's what they're doing. So he's hearing all this, right? And even through the chanting or the singing of hymns, especially psalms, he's hearing by definition. He's by definition hearing scripture. So all those kind of things. The prayers, again, he'd be praying things from the scriptures. Familiar things. So all these kind of things. He's been hearing this all night. All of that is a witness. All of that is, by definition, he's literally, in that sense, witnessing, hence the term. And he's seeing the fact that these guys are not broken and destitute and hopeless, but rather are vibrant, jubilant, confident, hopeful, and are trusting and have an unwavering, clearly already have an unwavering trust and confidence in the sovereignty of God. They're not flustered by this even remotely at all. And so that's the context in which why then the response, the first words out of his mouth are what you have in verse 30. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to highlight, right? It's not literally when you read, if you're just looking for the words of what Paul said in terms of the accounting, we don't have anything except for verse 25, but you have to follow the story. It's like any book or like any movie. You have to follow the story, right? And so then his response is, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved? What's my?" And so again, the earthquake and the calamitous nature of this, coupled with the fact that they didn't flee, but instead actually stayed in their cells, and actually saved his life in doing so. So earthquake, wrath of God, judgment of God, all of that, which is true, and yet on the tail end of that, here's the grace and mercy, right?
Supernatural event.
Yep.
Supernatural circumstances. A seeker of God of perhaps long-standing, we don't know.
Who knows? Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, maybe.
The amazing witness of these Christians clearly has an effect on some men, but not others.
Correct. Yeah, and all of that's under the sovereignty of God. Also, it's what I talked about in the weekend. Exactly. We saw the actions of Og of Bashan, the other Amorite king, who contrary to the previous Amorite king Sihon of Heshbon, where peace was offered, but he then rejected. Well, Og didn't even allow for it. There was no peace treaty to even be discussed because Og just launched a preemptive strike. Right? No. There's zero desire for peace on Og's part, and he suffered the consequences. Even though he would have known about the fact that his kin to the south, as it were offered peace terms. So clearly these Israelites are willing to offer peace, but he doesn't allow for that because he's just intent on wiping them out, and then suffers a defeat in the hands of that, as do all those who stand against the living God. Here you have the clear theme of judgment and wrath for injustice, in the face of injustice, right? The false imprisonment, the beating of Paul and Silas, blah, blah. But that's to demonstrate the goodness, right? That's why the Old Testament on a number of occasions often speaks about the goodness and the severity of God. Yeah. It's only, this analogy, the common analogy I tend to use to describe this is that of the night sky. We look out today where it's overcast. Even if it weren't overcast and it were actually just a plain sunny day, we don't see it because the light radiating from the sun casts out any ability for us to see beyond that through our atmosphere. It's only upon the black backdrop of the middle of the night that we see the stars shine so brightly. The grace of God, the mercy of God, the tenderness of God, the compassion of God is in the face of, or in not opposition, because it's all part of the one God, but it's in the light of, so it were, the wrath and the judgment and the justice. Not because those are bad things, but because those are just things that happen in the face of those who perpetrate evil. But yet grace and mercy are offered to those who have been evil, to those who have done wrong. And that's the context in which the sweetness seems so sweet in light of the potential bitterness that one may have faced. And so that's why he sees this and understands this immediately. They could have escaped very easily. He probably, again, it's an inference, but I think it's a reasonable one. He probably knows full well that these guys were not being, these guys were, or flip side, that these guys were falsely imprisoned. Right? He's not an idiot. He's a jailer. He knows the system. Right? He's not dumb. Sure. Right? He knows these guys are really probably falsely imprisoned. Has he done anything about it? No. But he knows they're falsely imprisoned.
He heard why. He heard about the girl.
That's what I'm saying.
He knew all the details.
That's what I mean. Yeah, he knows the details, but yet, I'm just doing my job.
He's getting paid.
Yeah, I'm getting paid. He's getting paid, and I'm just doing my job. How often have we heard that in the last couple of years? I'm just doing my job. The old Nuremberg defense. I'm just doing my job. Yeah, but what was your job? Your job was beating unarmed protesters. Your job was raiding the houses of pregnant mothers for posting something dislikable on Facebook. Not even going to something, just for posting something on Facebook. That was your job. So I was just doing my job. But your job was evil at that point.
It really highlights the bravery of those medical practitioners over the last
who have actually
years who have said no.
Correct, yeah, and as well as others, there are. It's a minority, but there was a minority of law enforcement officers who resigned over this, of people within the broader medical industry, who resigned, who actually stood by their convictions and were fired, who faced consequences, undue and corrupt consequences.
What an example of those people.
Correct, yeah.
To the Christians.
Correct, yeah.
The ones professing faith.
Yeah, and some of them were, but a number of them were not. Yeah, correct. That's the dichotomy. Yeah, but that's the thing about truth. Truth, even when, and listen, we fail. Christians will fail because we too are mortal, and we too are imperfect, and we too are also working out our salvation. But the truth remains objective throughout all that. Do you know what I mean? So the truth, I'm saying to you, the beauty of it is that truth is objective. And one is either in conformity to it or not. And so he asks, what am I to be saved? Verse 31, and they, as in Paul and Silas, say, believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your house. A strong statement, a very specific choice of words here by Paul and Silas, particularly with regard to how they refer to Jesus. They don't use the word. They don't use the word Christos, which equates to the Mashiach in Hebrew, Messiah, or the Anointed One, literally the King, because that has even though it's a perfectly accurate term, obviously we call Jesus Christ all the time, but has more of an immediate meaning to a Hebrew, to a Jew, than it does a Greek. Instead, he uses Jesus Kyrios. Kyrios has a much more powerful and explicitly divine connotation to it. Jesus just simply being the Greek transliteration of his name, Yeshua or Yehoshua. And so the point here is he's using a term that is carefully selected for his Hellenic audience of one, of a term that, as Kyrios, Lord, is really pointing to his divinity. Okay, the word Kyrios, Lord, is the word that is used and chosen by the apostles to translate the divine name from the Old Testament, Yahweh. What most translations just keep as the Lord, or which translations like we use it here or in the pulpit, the Legacy Standard Bible translate as Yahweh. That's the choice, that's the term that gets used in the New Testament for that name. It has this explicit divine connotation. That's why when Caesar was referred to as Kyrios, it's more than just the one who's in charge. Okay, and so that's an explicit choice of words. So he's functionally he's saying believe in Jesus, who is God. Believe in the divine Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your house. And they spoke the word of the Lord together, again, the word of the Lord, the word of God. Pardon me. To him together with all those who were in his household, and he took them that very hour of the night and washed their wounds, and immediately he was baptized, he and all his household. Verse 34, and then I'll pin these verses together. And he brought them into his house and set food before them. Literally prepares a table in the Greek. and rejoiced greatly with his whole household because he had believed in God. So pinning those verses of verse 32 to 34, the word of God is then made even more explicitly known to him, as well as those in his household, his oikos, to use the Greek word, which we've explained before, but that includes anyone in whatever his definition of household. That depends on the person. Cornelius' household was obviously gigantic. By virtue of him being a Roman centurion, it would have included obviously himself, his wife, his kids, his kin, any family he would have had with him, so relatives in other words, his soldiers, his servants, all those people are considered part of the household. And Acts 10 off memory even says that he also had friends with him as well, so people who were not identified even as family, but even beyond that. But nonetheless, he and his household, whatever this constitutes for the Philippian jailer, are baptized. And this is one point that even as Baptists should be taken into account. The temptation has been, especially in recent times, recent centuries, especially for Baptists, has been to individualize, even to the point of one might say hyper-individualize salvation, where it kind of gets boiled down to this singular equation of converting you, the individual, so that you kind of punch your ticket to heaven, so it were. Certainly in the West, that's the kind of broad kind of thrust that evangelism has sometimes taken. The thing is that in the scriptures, that's never the idea that's presented. There's always a communal or corporate, or especially to use a more particular word, familial context to it. This is now, for example, the third household baptism that we have. We've had Cornelius in chapter 10. We've had Lydia's household earlier in this chapter, and now we've got this one. And then there's a fourth one that's mentioned in the household of I think Stephanos in 1 Corinthians. But nonetheless, this is now the third time we've had a household baptism here. Even when you... Oh, you're ahead.
It's about headship.
That's what I'm getting onto,
It's about authority.
Correct.
And headship and authority in the last 200 years especially, since
150 to 200 years,
has been diluted.
To the point of annihilation, correct.
To the point now you look around and you think, where is headship in the family?
Correct. Yeah, and that's the point, and we've made this point plenty of times before. Yeah, exactly. The world is hierarchical because the order that God created is hierarchical. Again, you have the what's sometimes referred to as the great chain of being. It's been referred to by different terms, but you have God above the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, above the various different other, just to use a very generic broad term, angelic beings. Those like the ones that we refer to as the cherubim and seraphim, the throne guardians, okay? Like those who are messengers, like Gabriel, or like the two that are sent to Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah. You have others who are like, who have authority, like Michael, etc., etc., etc. There's hierarchy there, yeah? And that's no different on the earth. Okay, there is hierarchy. Hierarchy produces order by definition. And one of the things that I've said before explicitly is that what's occurred since the Enlightenment progressively through liberalism, capital L liberalism, and how that's flowed into not just the philosophy of liberalism, but then particularly liberal politics. So when I say liberal, I'm using it in the political sense, not referring to the Liberal Party. I'm referring to liberalism as a political philosophy, so like liberal democracy, for example. The way that then flowed out is that now here we are 200 plus years down the track, and the atomization of society where everything's been reduced down to the individual, and all that's been under the guise of freedom and liberty, but in reality it's actually been the opposite. Because the reality, what we've seen now, very obviously, and there's simply no denying this philosophically anymore, that it's so obvious that when you atomize down, so atom is in like referring to an atom, when you atomize everything down to the individual, You break familial connections, so break down the family. You break down communal connections, right? So the village, the town, etc. Your county or your shire, depending on what country you're in, right? All those kinds of things. And it all becomes about the individual, and you end up basically with a scenario where society is basically like a beanbag, right? It's filled with little beans, but they're all isolated, they're not connected to each other, and they can be reshaped and manipulated into anything, okay? Because it's actually familial bonds, the family, and family builds the village, which builds the town, which builds the society, right? Yeah. It's those connections, it's the connective tissue. It would be like breaking down all the connective tissue between your muscles and your bones, right? The things that actually hold the muscular system to the skeletal system, and breaking down all of those tendons. Well, what happens is your body doesn't function anymore. You can't move. That's what happens when you tear away tendons. So you break down the connective tissue that is family units that build communities, that build kingdoms, right? Build nations, and you break it all the way down to the individual, and you can manipulate everyone on a mass level because they're all now just a bunch of individuals, right?
It's a very, if one were a conspiracy theorist, it's a very, very clever ploy.
Genius, yeah.
To really act against God in all ways, from A to Z.
A to Z, yeah.
The authority that the family structure you were talking about is the very family structure which applied in this epoch and for centuries afterwards, where the father was the head of the family. And in my view, the very strong inference from this is that the obverse of familial structure and headship by the father is obedience by the rest of the household to the head of the family.
Correct.
Obedience. What 100%. We've done now by this atomization process we've observed as students of history over the last period is we've taken obedience away from the family members, meaning obedience to the head of the household, the father. And we've cut and pasted it to governmental authority.
Yeah, exactly, to the state. Yep, the state has taken over. Yep, and that's the point I've made, is that, and this point got made last week, it's been made in previous times, the way that this has been achieved, there's the political and the religious side of the equation. The political side of the equation is the elimination of well, for the most, either literally or at least functionally, the elimination of the kings. So the literal sense is like France. The functional sense is like us, Australia, where we are on paper a constitutional parliamentary monarchy.
Nominally.
But functionally it's not. Functionally we have a vice regent, which we call a governor general, who by definition rubber stamps, and it's a famous incident when they don't, vis-a-vis Gough Whitlam.
Yes.
Right? So it's a major historic event when the vice regent, the governor general, does not rubber stamp it, right? That becomes literally part of our national history, right? So that shows you how often it's just a rubber stamp. So in other words, the monarch, represented through the vice regent, the governor general, is by definition ceremonial and almost entirely symbolic, okay? So functionally, that's why, for example, countries like Australia get kind of colloquially referred to as crowned republics, right? Which is interesting. I mean, in one sense we are, because we're the Commonwealth of Australia. The word Commonwealth historically is a synonym for a republic, okay? The Commonwealth under Cromwell, for example, back in the 1650s.
The common weal, the common good.
Well, yeah, exactly. It means the common good. Yeah, the common good. It's a republican term. So either literally getting rid of the kings like France, or functionally getting rid of the kings like Australia, etc., has been a disaster because historically the kings obviously did many things, including keeping the political class, i.e. the aristocracy, in check. That's why the great revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly those of America and France, despite common misconception, were not led by the people; they were led by the aristocracy. Right? This is Maximilian Robespierre, right? This is Napoleon. All these kinds of figures. Using the people. Manipulating and using the people. Yes, correct. Just like you saw here, led by the magistrates and the wealthy cabal to whip up the people, to do evil, right? It's the same thing. All these kinds of things. And so you eliminate the kings politically. So that's the political side of the equation. You eliminate monarchy. And then on the religious side, you eliminate God. Both sides of the equation, right? And then you allow unfettered power. And so then what that does is that then creates the necessary starting point to then start over the course of decades that build into centuries for now 150, 200 years to break down all the various other strata, like all the way down to the familial level, the communal level, right? And by eliminating that, what you're doing is actually not technically an elimination. It's actually just a transference, which is what we're pointing to here. The people who bemoan or who gripe the headship of the father in the household utterly fail in almost every circumstance to understand the commensurate responsibilities that come with that, the burden that comes with that,
the duty.
That's what I mean. The duty, right? The duty that comes with that. The fact that the father is meant to lead with good governance and with wisdom that is accrued often through trials and through great difficulties and through sometimes often losses, with wisdom that is for the benefit of others before himself, for the benefit of the whole before the individual, that is with the full knowledge and understanding that when push comes to shove, not only in small things but even in the largest of things, he is called to sacrifice and lay down his needs and his desires for the needs of the family, including the point of his very life. So the responsibilities of what the father bears often gets magically forgotten in the discussion. That he serves by leading. That's how he serves, right? He doesn't lead by serving. It's serving by leading, right? The best thing he can do for his family is to lead them in ways that are good, in ways that are righteous, in ways that are just, right? That are merciful and compassionate. All these various things. And so when the authority that comes with that and the ability to steer the proverbial ship of the family and through that more broadly the community, which are communities are just made up of families, what you end up having when you eliminate that or remove that from the father is someone has to fill the vacuum. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of which. It's just like with religion, right? The myth of secularity, right? Of we're a secular society where all the religious views are just on an even playing field, and then the secular ethos that is kind of like the umbrella over that, and just keeps all in check. No. It's not a matter of if we'll have religion, if we'll have God. It's a matter of which God you'll have. It's a matter of which religion, right? That's what it is, and that's been proven. That's so obviously demonstrated now. We're now so far down the track. You can very, very clearly see that when you just analyse how these philosophies have developed, right? The whole Enlightenment ideal of removal of God, removal of the ancien régime, to call it, as the French would call it, the ancient regime, the old way of Christianity. The removal of that was the very thing that gave birth 150 years down the pipe to both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Two ideologies which hated each other with an existential passion, that fought against each other, yet they're both descendants of the exact same people. They're descendants of the same ideologies, right?
That's what's so grievous, because as a student of those proponents of that modern ideology, I know how earnest those proponents and how sincere they were.
Absolutely, yeah, correct.
But they were sincerely wrong.
Sincerely wrong. Correct, and that's why even on the most fundamental metaphysical sense, the truthfulness of something is not determined, and indeed cannot logically be determined, by how strongly one believes it. Right? So my strength of confidence, my strength of trust in what I read in this, that's not the arbiter of whether it actually is true or not, right? So it stands, ontologically, it stands as true or not in and of itself, irrespective of what I think
It's
about it.
external to
Exactly, yeah.
It's
the
external,
human.
correct.
It's
And that's part of this atomization.
like morality.
Yep, like morality, correct. And this is the whole point about the atomization. This is why, and this is what I try to explain to people to help people see the bigger picture. Like when people are confused, as why are we seeing all this stuff about issues of like transgenderism and various other things of me and my identity, where the identity has now become, my personal self-identity has become this gigantic, massive thing, be I transgender, non-binary, intersex, queer,
My truth.
whatever other concept. Yeah, it comes down from this current position that we're in, which we refer to philosophically as, or which is broadly referred to as philosophically as postmodernism. Basically, the concept that truth is unknowable outside of yourself. There is no ultimate objective truth, and only that which can be understood or perceived within the 6 inches between your ears, only that can actually be even remotely real. But even then, though, there's no ultimate way of verifying that, okay? Because basically the perspective is truth can't be known beyond your, and this is, if I was to lay this all out, it would take 2 hours, and we'd have to go all the way back through Hume and Hegel and Kant, really, especially Kant, and all the way down through Nietzsche and other figures, how you get here, right? Because these things develop. But the point being is that truth is unknowable outside or beyond myself. That's why it's such an egregious philosophy to teach to kids, especially, because you're actually teaching them that they're basically trapped in their own head. That's fundamentally what the consequences of that idea is. And so that's why it's such an existentially disastrous thing for teenagers. So for a teenage girl who's going through puberty and is experiencing various different things that just naturally happen to teenage girls going through puberty, that at times can indeed result in confusion, because you're only 12, 13, 14 years old and you don't really understand what's going on in the bigger picture of the world, and you already have enough pressure because of school and my friends and social things, this, blah, blah. Same thing on the boy side of the equation too. I'm just using this as one example, right? What's the message they get in the face of that? It's not truth is external, morality is external. Any current difficulties you're going through, you can actually punch through and get to the other side of, and grow up and flourish as a human being. No, that's not what's told to them. Instead, what's told to them is, truth actually can't be known beyond yourself. You are functionally trapped in your own head. And so this is where we get the idea of, I can be a boy trapped in a girl's body. Right? That's where the only context in which that kind of concept can arise, as self-evidently illogical as it is, let alone biologically, that's only possible because the prevailing ideology has become that truth is unknowable beyond your own mind, beyond your own perception. And so you become literally trapped in yourself. Hence why it's such an existential disaster. Because, and again, that's why none of on the transgenderism issue, to keep going with that, that's why none of the surgeries, gender affirmation surgeries, inverted commas, that's why none of them work. We know for a fact the suicide rate post-operation is exactly the same as it is pre-op, right? And the suicide rate is already disastrous, right? 80% attempt it, half of them are successful, so it's roughly about 40%. And people often, if they don't understand how astronomically and unparalleled in height that is, we think that the suicide rate, from what we can tell, for Jews during the Holocaust was somewhere around like 7 or 8%. Right? So Jews literally in Auschwitz were killing themselves at a rate of like not even 25% of what kids with transgenderism do, or people who are going through this issue go through.
I wonder if the Enlightenment fathers, as it were, if they had foreseen this society that we have devolved into, if they had foreseen it, would they have been so vehement and earnest in their proclamations?
The answer is, so the first part of that question is, do I think most of them foresaw this? It's an overwhelmingly no, and then the minority of yeses is a yes with an asterisk. So the overwhelming answer is no. The overwhelming answer is no. There's no reason in any of the in anyone that you could ever possibly hope to read from the Enlightenment period in Europe, especially the academics, that would cause us to now think that they could foresee any of the consequences, which is half the problem. But the minority that's a yes, the only people that I would give a minority yes to, but with a very big asterisk, and I'll explain the asterisk in a sec, is the libertines. Okay, so the libertines were those like the Marquis de Sade in France and other such famous libertines. The libertines were basically those who actually took the Enlightenment to its logical conclusions. Abandon God, even if I keep him in a sense of, because most Enlightenment era philosophers weren't so stupid as to think that God didn't exist. They acknowledge that it's evident that God does exist. Just simply though that he basically, and this is a massive oversimplification, but just for the sake of time, that God had a creative role and then essentially, it's a deistic perspective, and then he just simply allowed nature to just unfold and take its course, okay? So this is where we get the concept of the laws of nature, which is a very interesting concept historically. I won't go into that now because that would take forever. But point being, but by casting off God, right, because one of the prevailing perspectives was that human beings are actually the ones who come to understand morality through our reason, through our human faculties, which is not what this says at all. And so by doing that, people like Marquis de Sade and other such famous libertines, especially in France, but not exclusively, took that to its logical conclusions and went, well, if humanity is the one who comes to our understanding of morality, then we can make it whatever we want. And if we can make it whatever we want, because we're the ones who ultimately make the decision, we come to it through a human reason, through our enlightened reasonable faculties, then we can make it whatever we want, including we can make it nothing. Right? And so libertine was more of it was a description of such people who held to such philosophy that anything goes. Literally in every possible sense. And I'm not going to run you through the life story of Marquis de Sade, because I wouldn't be terribly keen on cleaning up the vomit afterwards. But levels of moral depravity that actually border on impressive, because of how absolutely, literally in the truest sense of the word, unbridled, unrestrained, unrestricted, their actions and their lifestyle now was.
Accepting the descriptors you just gave were correct, but I think unseen since the Roman times and unseen since the Babylonian times, because we've seen them before.
Yeah, and what's even fascinating about how much of a train wreck the Enlightenment's been for the West and for the world more broadly. When you mention Rome, the kind of things we're seeing now were not actually present in Rome for most of Rome's existence. It's late stage Rome we start to see this.
Sure.
So that's when so Rome at its height, when the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, ruled the world, none of this went.
No.
Men married one woman for
I'm
life.
talking about when society begins
to unravel, exactly, and that's the point I'm drawing. So the things that we're seeing now is late stage Roman dominant, so late stage Roman Empire, in other words. By the time you start getting into late 4th and then through the 5th century, so the 400s AD, that's when we see this stuff coming in, and Rome collapses basically a century after it starts doing these things on a mass level. All these things are the signs of a civilization decaying, because we've seen this throughout history before.
Including transgenderism, by the way.
The whole box and dice, yes.
We've seen it before.
Yeah, all they are the telltale signs of a civilization that collapse, and that's not my opinion. It's just history. Yeah.
Yep. By the way, reassignment surgery was available in Roman times.
Correct, it was, yeah, absolutely. Yep, correct. We have evidence of those kinds of practices. And all those various things. The common misnomer is that ancient Greco-Roman society was just utterly filled to the brim with very liberal sexual practices. That was a specific subsect, especially around the temples. So, like, if, say, for example, the cult of Aphrodite in Corinth. Okay, but en masse through most of Roman or even Greco-Roman history, it wasn't normative at all to just have mass orgies every week, right? That wasn't a normal practice. It's a common modern misreading of Greco-Roman sources. They were. Don't get me wrong. They were not. They were not saying, oh, they were great, perfectly morally upset. No. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying though is that the common misconception, especially in Hellenic culture, in Greek culture, that it was just constant public open sexual flauntation and liberality. That's not even close to being true.
No, they had a strictured moral code.
Yeah.
And even the unspeakable vice of the Greeks
Yeah.
was limited,
That's what I'm
constrained
to specific contexts.
Under very specific circumstances.
And that's still morally wrong. But the point I'm drawing is it's not an appraisal of that. It's saying, though, that the common misnomer that the Greeks were just completely sexually libertine in public is not true. It's patently not true. It was specific context. And those specific contexts were morally egregious. But it wasn't this mass public thing until Rome starts collapsing. And that's when you see it become public and mass public. And you see that in Jerusalem. You see it in Jerusalem. Right, during the siege of Jerusalem, mass rampant public immorality. The zealots there's mass transgenderism among the zealots. Brothels literally in the street, in public, in broad daylight, like all these kind of things. Yeah.
10 years ago, you would not have seen the rainbow flag being flown in Jerusalem. No way.
Yeah, or in public, even here in public, you wouldn't have seen it. Yeah.
Sure, whatever you want.
Well, Tel Aviv is, yeah.
In Tel Aviv, yeah.
Tel Aviv is a bit of a particular fish. Yeah.
But in Jerusalem, now go to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
10 years later, 10 years on.
10 years on, yeah. Yeah, but that's what happens. These are signs of civilizational collapse because they always have been. That's why it's not. I'm not. You know. I'm not. It's not the boy who cries wolf. That's not what's going on here. I'm pointing to known, verifiable historical trends that demonstrate a similar thread of civilizational collapse. Because it's the breaking down of order, and when you break down order, you're only left with chaos, and that's what ended up coming. Circle back here. The last point I'll make on verse 34. Before then, the passage kind of rounds off through 35 to the end, with the last point that gets made here in this morning's passage. In verse 34, one thing I want you to notice here is in this concept of headship that ties it all together. The Philippian jailer himself is still the one who's very much in view. This is the whole point that I make, that even the Baptists tend to just we've almost entirely lost at this point. Is the familial context, the family context of religion, okay? Family context of faith, and consequently, therefore, of baptism. His household converts to Christianity because he converts to Christianity, okay? His household is baptized because he gets baptized, because he believed. That's the wording in the Greek, again, verse 34. And he brought them in, as in referring to Paul and Silas. He sets a table before them, right? So fellowship, right? Communion, literally in that sense. And rejoiced greatly with his whole household because he had believed in God. He rejoices with his household because he believed in God. Do you see what I'm saying? That's headship. That being smart. I'm being honest. I'm saying this even as a pastor in a Baptist church. This is a classic point that the other Protestant traditions, obviously, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Lutherans, etc., the Eastern churches, etc., will go to demonstrate the points about infant baptism. And without being smart, they've got a pretty strong point when it comes to this passage. Right?
It's a difficult one, this passage, for evangelical Protestantism.
Yeah, because all the point I'm making is, I'm not diving into a debate about baptism. All the point I'm trying to make here, though, is about the familial context, right? Is what you're seeing is we've already had a number of these examples. This is just another example of the fact that salvation is not primarily individually focused. It's actually corporately focused. It's focused on family. It's focused on people. You see this even throughout the Old Testament. That's why disjoining this from the Old Testament is usually unhelpful. It's through Abraham. Who moves to the promised land? Who travels? Does Abraham just set out on a journey by himself?
No.
No, he's got his whole kit. He's got his whole clan. His whole clan, right?
Didn't he have
300
servants?
Yeah, has practically has an army. That's what I mean. He's a commander of it. He has his own. He has his own militia, essentially, functionally. That's why he's able to, and that's why he's able to, rescue
And
rescue
who do they all
rescue
look
others.
for truth, for guidance, for
right,
leadership.
right. They look to the patriarch of the family. Yeah, that's the whole point. So even though we think of Abraham as being a singleton, he and his clan are the ones who make the journey.
It's
right? Through you, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. You individually? No, you and your family. Through you and your Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right? That's the whole point. Right? And the whole it's always contextual. So that hasn't changed in the New Testament. Right? All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of every individual. No. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. It's still in the national context. And so what you end up having, that's why a common way that God has operated over the last 2,000 years has, at times, he's done it bottom up, right? You're seeing ground up here. But there are other times where he goes the other direction, top down. He converts kings.
Same with baptism.
Sometimes
before conversion, sometimes after conversion.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, both ends of the direction, 100%. Yeah, Clovis I, the king of the Franks, in around the year 500, converts to Christianity, and that's the beginning of Christian rule in the kingdom of the Franks, which is where we get the word France from, right? In what was historically called Gaul, right? And so the royal household converts to Christianity, and then flowing down from there, the Franks progressively convert to Christianity. So that's top down. So God's done it both directions, bottom up, like ground up and top down.
Are you saying that God is not predictable?
Well, he's predictable, but he's beyond our finite, limited perspective on being able to understand. And that's the whole point of trusting in God, is that a failure to trust God, ironically, actually becomes an act of pride. People often don't think of those terms, but really it actually is, and I'm not the only person. You can go all throughout church history and find the great theologians and church fathers who have said this. A lack of trust in God, a lack of trust in the sovereignty of God, is actually an act of pride, because it's actually trying to assume, it's failing ultimately, but it's an attempt at least, to assume unto yourself a level of omniscience that you don't have. Okay? So basically here's what happens. Things like this happen. Let's just say I'll put myself in Paul's position. I've been beaten to a pulp. I've been falsely in prison. I'm now in prison here. Okay. What it's doing is, if I'm anxious, I'm worried, I'm questioning. Not even just beyond like the tacit doubt, although that's a problem, but like questioning. I'm abandoning. All these kind of things, right? Going wrong. What I'm doing, philosophically, and theologically, is I'm assessing the situation at hand. I'm actually making not just a value judgment, I'm actually basically predicting the future outcome of how this is going to turn out, and I decide that it's going to turn out poorly. Hence why I'm anxious, hence why I'm worried, hence why, this could really go bad, blah, blah, blah. So I'm leaning on this is going to go bad, but even that verbiage of going to end up poorly, this is me acting as if I know what the future is going to be. Do you understand? And so it's an act of omniscience, or an attempted omniscience that you don't have, right? And so hence in that sense, it's ultimately actually ironically an act of pride. Instead, recognize that actually I'm finite, I am mortal, I don't know all things, I don't know the specifics of the future, but there is one who does. And he's not me, thank God. Thankfully it's not me, it's God. And here's what he has said, da-da-da-da-da-da. He's demonstrated his bona fides, da-da-da-da-da-da. Old Testament, right, particularly. Right, or for us now, we're looking at the whole thing, Old and New Testament. He's clearly trustworthy. He's clearly the only one who's omniscient and omnipotent and eternal. I therefore trust him as opposed to trusting my emotional predictions as to how I think this is going to turn out. You know what I mean? So actually, it's an act of, when trusting God is an act of humility, not trusting God is actually an act of pride. Do you see? Yeah, and that's where we end up. And so let's finish up with verses 35 through 40, which ties together to a point that particularly we touched on largely last week as well. So verse 35, now when day came, the chief magistrates sent their policemen, saying, release those men. Now, this brings a very obviously interesting response. The Ravduchos, the policemen. So these are Roman police. Roman police were very easily identifiable because they carried what's in Latin called a fasces, which is a pile of rods, of sticks that are bound together. This is where we actually get the word fascism from. Okay. It was used. It was basically, think of it basically like a police baton. Okay. And it wasn't anything nefarious. It was just literally just a tool, an instrument or a tool that the police would use. But that symbol, so fascism ends up connecting itself back to that term fasces, like a rod of authority, and et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, that's where you actually get the word from. That's why in many Republican nations, including America, you can see, you can see the symbol of, I was about to say fascist symbology, but that wouldn't make etymological sense. You can see the symbol of the fasces in many different Republican societies. If you look at the House of Representatives in the United States Congress, up the back where it has the backdrop American flag, "In God We Trust" is the American motto. On the side, there's two marble pillars which actually have fasces on them. It's a Republican symbol. Anyway, so these are police officers who were identified by such means, and they come and they say, "Release those men," to the warden, the prison guards, the jailers. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The chief magistrates have sent to release you, therefore come out now and go in peace." But verse 37, Paul says to them, "Having beaten us in public without trial, men who are Romans," referring to themselves, "they've thrown us into prison. And now they're sending us away secretly, kick rocks, start walking towards the cliff and keep on walking. Get screwed," is basically his response. "Rather, let them come themselves and bring us out." So this is just the tail end of the political corruption, right? I want you to see what both things are going on here. They've been in prison for one night, and then they're being released. So released. So in other words, imprisoned, technically with charge, but ridiculous, trumped-up charges, and then imprisoned on false charges. So now falsely imprisoned, and then you're releasing them. So they're not facing trial. You're actually releasing them, which means that the charges in the imprisonment were bogus. So it's the tacit acknowledgement that the charge and that the arrest and imprisonment were bogus and illegal, but we're trying to secretly scurry you away. Now it's when day came. When day came means this is basically at dawn. This is early in the morning. People may or may not be up yet. The town Philippi may or may not be bustling. There may be a few people about, maybe who are up early, but this is
Get rid of the evidence.
This is getting rid of the evidence. Early morning. There's no mass peoples in the streets. They're hurrying them. They're getting them out of sight when people aren't up yet. The corruption's just oozing here, right? They're tacitly and implicitly admitting that the arrest and imprisonment were completely illegal. But we're going to try and scurry you out at dawn, and we're going to do so we're just going to send the police to do it. We're not going to be public. We're not going to be seen in connection. We're going to be asleep in our household, or we're going to be seen in some other public place so that we're not seen in connection with this, right? All these kind of things. And Paul essentially calls them out on it.
Yeah.
He says, no, you falsely arrest us, falsely imprison us on trumped up charges. You beat the daylights out of us illegally because we're Roman citizens, and you know it. And that's exactly what it says here, right? Because if you have a look in verse 38, and the policeman reported these words back to the chief magistrates. They, as in the chief magistrates, were afraid when they heard that they were Romans. So they're freaking out now, right? They're freaking out because, oh, they're Romans. And they know what they did was illegal. It was immoral anyway. But it was illegal because they were Romans, right? They could have done this if they weren't Romans because you were Roman or you were a barbarian. But you couldn't do it, especially to a Roman. Not legally. And they know this now, and so they're panicking, and so they're trying to sweep this under the rug. So this is just the full circle, what we had last week, the full circle of the absolute, not just moral and ethical, but political corruption that's being displayed here. It's disgusting. And so then they came and appealed to them as in the chief magistrates, came and appealed to Paul and Silas. And when they had brought them out, they kept requesting them to leave the city. In other words, they come cap in hand, as it were, to Paul and Silas, all apologetic and really and nice and saying, oh, this is just a big mistake, and all the kind of excuses you can possibly imagine would roll out of their tongues. But if you can just quickly vacate the city, and so that people can forget about this and hopefully don't realise that we've done something completely illegal, and so that this hopefully doesn't make its way up the chain all the way back to Caesar, that'd be great. That's basically what they're doing here. It's not. You could go now and you could find a dozen news articles in the next 5 minutes of a story that would be almost identical to this from our time. Do you know what I mean? Like how many? Like this is so the level of corruption, and then you get caught out having done something illegal, and then the immediate turn of attitude and the complete flip, and then trying to scurry around and not even necessarily fix it, but just simply sweep it under the rug and make sure it gets out of the public eye and have this distraction and don't see all the kind of stuff. That's literally what goes on today. Like it should be so blindingly obvious how this happens all the time now politically. And that's just proof positive that it's no different, right? This is what happens when, in this case, politicians abandon God as the authority above them. This is what happens. You're accountable to no one except yourself and the ever-changing whims of the people, and you will do anything and everything to manipulate systems and to do things, whether they be legal or illegal, as long as you feel you can possibly get away with it. That's just where we are, and that's what happens. So this, on the political side, because we've seen a lot of other things, but on the political side, connecting all these this whole account together, this is Christian leaders. You want to speak truth to power, and that phrase that people always use. Preach a sermon on this passage, well, this whole story going back to what we've seen this week and last week. Yeah. Because this is the political corruption that was present in their day, and it's no different to political corruption that's present in our day. And it's proof positive that again, there's nothing new under the sun, like Solomon once said, right? It's just the recycling of the same old. And so in verse 40, when they went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia, which is obviously where the Philippian church had been established, in the house of Lydia from back earlier in the chapter. And when they saw the brothers, they encouraged them and left. And so this is the rounding up of this portion of this story. So the household of Lydia, in other words, the church of Philippi, is founded upon the household of Lydia, so the house of Lydia and the house of the Philippian jailer. That's the beginnings. Those are the foundational pillars of the church of Philippi. And so to harken back to your point you raised earlier about, did God orchestrate all these various things for the conversion of ultimately one man, and by extension, the bringing into Christianity of his household? Yeah. Because guess who's the foundation of the church at Philippi, which is a church that still stands to this day? The house of Lydia, the house of the Philippian jailer.
Amazing.
That's the pillars. Those are the foundations. That's the pillars of that church that's been around for 2,000 years now. Yeah. God orchestrates massive events beyond even and this is not a gigantic grand scale. But when you actually connect this all the way back through, ultimately, in terms of at least the way it played out, this doesn't happen unless, well, more than a decade now, nearly 12-ish, 13 years ago now, Paul's converted. So Paul's conversion is or rather the other way around. This is a direct consequence of Paul's conversion. Do you understand?
By the way, even in our own lineages, innumerable conversions have taken place to the head of a household.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then for generations afterwards, believers have followed from that conversion.
Yeah.
Correct. I thought my point exactly, and that's how it works. I'm saying, and it's always the familiar. The family is the basic unit of society. It always is, not the individual, because it can't be. And that's why the Enlightenment era idea is so demonstrably wrong philosophically, because an individual doesn't just pop into existence, just out of ex nihilo, out of nothing. They come from what? Parents, i.e. a family. So the family's the individual. When you try and bring to, it's trying to think through it atomistically when that's not how it works. It's what's the point of reduction before I can go any lower? Well, the individual. Yeah, but you're failing to understand that the individual doesn't come from nothing.
No.
The individual comes from parents, i.e. family. So that means by definition that the family is the basic unit. And that's the point I made however many weeks ago when we went through that passage in Deuteronomy 2 in the sermons series, where Moses is recounting his division of the people, of the Israelites, all the way down to the smallest unit, which was what? Not 1, 10, i.e. the family. Right? The family is the basic unit. So it's almost like I'm not reinventing the wheel. I'm just saying what this says. And it's logically demonstrable because the individual doesn't just pop out of nothing. It comes from parents. Even in the gerrymandering hacking of the reproductive process like we do with IVF, where we try to play God, none of that works without ultimately sperm and egg. So again, parents. So even as we try to play God through those kinds of biological hacks, it still doesn't avoid the fact that you still need a mother and a father, right? And so the foundational pillars are in the familial context. The Church of Philippi is literally proof positive of that. And so, yeah, this is the amount of this chapter is a really, really important chapter that brings with it so many lessons that we've seen, obviously all throughout. And I'll finish on this one final point. Verse 37, particularly and especially, verse 37 is all the evidence you need that the notion that Christians should not get political is just utter rubbish. Utter rubbish. Paul directly to their face calls them out on the absolute, complete moral and ethical corruption. Tells them to absolutely kick rocks, and no, you're not going to pull this. No, you're not going to do this. You're not just going to shuffle us away at the break of dawn when the town is quiet and people aren't out, and shuffle us off out the back door, so it were, and out of the city. No, you're not going to do this. We're Roman citizens, and this comes up again later on in chapter, I think 21 or 22, which is where this absolute kangaroo court that's eventually the court that then tries Paul and sends him off to Rome for execution. Well, he appeals to Caesar as a result of that. We'll cover that when we get there, but that's the same exact thing. And Paul basically spends the entire chapter just taking the mickey out of them because he's mocking them, because as he should, because it's such a kangaroo court. They violated 600. They beat him up again, not this lot, but that court beats him up again, complete violate, the whole box and dice, right? Because that's what happens when God is removed from the equation politically. And we're in the position that we're in now in the West for a variety of reasons, which are often very deep, complex and historical. But one of the more easily identifiable surface level ones is the fact that for a number of decades now, certainly since definitely since the late 1940s into the 1950s, the prevailing ethos in the West among evangelical Christians has been that pastors and preachers shouldn't talk about politics, just talk about the gospel.
Oh.
Really? Because this entire passage has both the gospel and politics.
Yeah, that's right.
And so what happens is you don't deal with politics, guess who will? Someone else.
Yes.
And guess who that someone else is? Enemies of God, right?
Yes.
People who are not bringing order but sowing chaos. People who don't build anything but rather destroy. People who take that which was good and then manipulate it and then pervert it for the purpose of evil. That's what happens. And so now you're witnessing, and you saw the greatest exposition of that idea in and through the whole COVID thing where you had clergymen like myself who were and other Christians who were actually standing up and saying, no, this is wrong, this is bad, blah, blah, blah. And then you had the swath load of others who were absolutely towing the line for the narrative, capital N, with a trademark symbol at the end of it, and telling you to just basically shut up and trust the science and the white-robed oligarchy that we all came under. Of these previously unknown figures called the chief health officer, which no one knew 5 minutes beforehand, who now, yeah, correct, who'd never practiced who never actually practiced medicine in their life,
No.
No.
and who now was given such literally plenary powers under the Public Health Act 2010 that they were practically gods on earth because there was almost nothing that they couldn't do.
No.
There was virtually nothing short of blindingly obvious murder that was actually illegal to them. Right? Levels of power that the West has quite literally, that would literally make, that would make medieval kings blush and go, there's no way you allow them to do that. Right.
It's very sad because that's not over, as one of the several countries if not all the countries in the Western Hemisphere, who systematically cede more, meaning CEDE,
exactly.
more and more of our power to the World Health Organization. It's just...
I know there's such transnational...
What's coming upon us next time is going to be even worse.
Correct, and on even more existentially dire, I say in inverted quotes, bases like, global boiling and other such ridiculous terms, which we're now trying to use, and how we need to all, how property needs to be confiscated, and we now need to kill all your cows, and you can't drive anywhere anymore, and now you have to be confined to everything within 15 minutes of your location, and all the other 1,000 different things that are just so of such like glaringly obvious acts of tyranny that for most people will just simply go straight over their heads.
This passage is, in my view, rather instructive for preachers or anyone expounding the gospel. It's an intriguing insight into Paul's character.
Correct.
Because one could argue that it was his pride. He was standing up for himself to the jailers, to the authorities, the magistrates, the politicians.
Some would try to make that argument. Yeah, they would try to.
It looks as though he's prideful. He's putting his foot down and he's saying, no, you've done a wrong to us and I'm not putting up with it. But that's not exactly correct. Not what's going on here.
Correct, yeah, exactly. Because it's actually standing up for truth. Because what he's doing here, by standing up for himself and Silas, what he's actually doing is he's standing up for all Christians.
Absolutely.
Do you understand? Because what he's doing is he's establishing, well, he's doing many things, but he's establishing precedent. No, we're not going to just take this, because what you're doing is it's not just even immoral, it's illegal by your own laws.
Yeah.
Your own Roman laws, this is illegal, let alone before you even get onto the moral and ethical equation, right? Because things, as we well know, can be perfectly legal whilst being patently immoral. Legality does not equal morality. Not inherently at least. And so what you're doing here is patently illegal by Rome's own laws, and you know it. You know it, I know you know it, and you know that I know that you know it.
Oh, my goodness.
You understand?
Yeah.
You know it, and I know it, and you know that I know that you know it. Okay? You're not hiding anything here. He's seeing right through this, is the point I'm trying to make. I know it sounds funny, but that's just true.
Beacons of light.
We're
called to be beacons of light.
Correct.
What is Paul here? He's a beacon of light. He's showing them their own hypocrisy.
Exactly. And it's not through the force of his might. He doesn't have any. The scriptures, as well as the early church accounts, pretty clearly indicate Paul was nothing physically imposing by any means at all. If anything, he was small. If anything, he was at least average height, maybe even smaller, and he wasn't physically big. Others are different. Silas is a big guy, and is described essentially as such in the previous chapters as clearly being why there was not Silas, I should say, Barnabas. Back when Paul and Barnabas are misidentified as try to be worshipped as Zeus and Hermes, they worship Paul as Hermes the messenger, but they attempt to worship Barnabas as Zeus, the king of the gods, a very intimidating figure. But that's basically tacit description that Barnabas was a big, strong guy, which is fine. But with Paul here, there's nothing. He's not coming and saying. At no point is he saying, me and my might, and I challenge you to. I challenge you to combat, to single combat, and if you don't release me, I'm going to bring down my army upon you. No, none of that.
He did wield a sword.
Yes.
The sword of the mouth.
The sword of truth, yeah, the sword of truth, 100%, and exactly right. And so, but he's not shying away at all here. So despite,
No,
do you understand?
brave.
That's what I'm saying to you. Yeah, actually courageous, because when you stand up for, in this, it's it's him and Silas, but it's functionally himself, right? Him and Silas. When he's standing up for him and Silas, he's ultimately actually standing up for all the Christians. Do you understand? He's standing for everyone. Do you understand? He's standing up for everyone.
Including into the future.
That's my point. It's setting precedent. That's what I'm behind by precedent. It's actually establishing it for the future. At the moment, and it's growing. Fortunately, more people have realised through COVID that they were on the wrong side of the issue, and praise God for that. Right? Forgiveness is always available. Right? It's not some if you fail during COVID, you're done. No, obviously not. Right? Forgiveness and grace, God's grace and forgiveness, is more powerful than the sins that mankind produce. That's the whole point. And so God is able to forgive to the uttermost. The point being here, though, is that more people are realising that they were on the wrong side of this, and praise God for that. They got, and not even just Christians, even people beyond Christian. We've had. I mean, at my place, we're doing remodeling on one of the floors of our house, and so we've had workers in, laying floors, painting walls, etc. for like a week now, and I don't have any obvious reason. Some of them might be Christian, who knows? But there's no logical reason to assume that they are. And all week I've just been listening to talk about COVID was done with this, the government that idea, whatever. Right, because they're just Joe Schmo workers, and God bless them. But it's because it's so obvious, it's so patently obvious that we're not just being governed by incompetence and by ignoramus. We're being governed by people who are patently immoral, who are corrupt, who are absolutely in bed with private corporations. Who are doing the bidding of very wealthy people, powerful people, which is exactly what you saw here. Wealthy cabal of people using religious fervour for financial gain, like the priestess. As soon as their little money-making operation is done away with by Paul, who do they appeal to? Chief magistrates, politicians. And the politicians whip the crowd into a frenzy to then beat the smoke out of Paul and Silas. It's
remarkable when
big business and politics. This is 2,000 years ago. It's almost like I'm not making it up. Like it's just like it's here. Do you know what I'm saying to you? Nothing changes. This is the tendency of where culture and society gets to when God is not the one who is in obedience to, right? When God is not the one. When people try vainly to remove God from his rightful authority position. This is what happens. So, they're going to go there. Thank you.